clearly the time that we're in at the moment, risk management is a not just a hot topic, but it's probably fundamental to what not just procurement but organizations are thinking about, and specifically around resiliency. So I think we picked a good kind of kick-off topic around risk management, and you and I have talked in the past around and I'm gonna steal your line and say that the ROI of a risk management problem, the risk management program is never more evident than in the middle of a crisis.
Right, and if you're not in a crisis, there's no ROI. People are looking at it thinking, why the heck are you? What's the business case for me to spend all this money? We'll go and get car insurance, but we don't necessarily want to invest in risk management and mitigation until something happens, and that's like the burning platform. And then you kind of trying to catch up at that point. Exactly.
And I think one of the things that jumps out at me is that whilst most organizations are looking at sort of the short term, which is the need to drive cash, clearly, and that's both liquidity in their organization and hopefully they're considering liquidity in their broader supply chain as well. And I think I've seen competing articles that talk about just extend your payment terms. And then I've also seen articles that say, well, you've got to consider about maybe paying your suppliers earlier than you would normally do if you've got the cash. And I think those are two interesting pieces. I'm more firmly in the latter part than the former part, but I understand the drive to kind of keep cash and build that survival kit. So there's the liquidity piece. There's clearly some requirements probably from procurement to say we need some savings. And whilst I don't think procurement's ever going to get away from the number one KPI, or certainly one of the top 5 KPIs is always going to be about how have you generated savings. I think right now, and I'm not going to say now more than ever, but right now, I think that it's a case of it's procurement's time to shine, and I've seen a lot of stuff with that. And I think I personally think there's a bit of a risk here for procurement, not just not to deliver savings. We're never going to get away from that. But the risk is in 6 months' time, in 9 months' time, in 12 months' time, and hopefully we're in a post-COVID world. It's like, well, we don't need the savings anymore. Thanks very much. And we're a bit more marginalized. What do you think about that?
I think it's a huge risk. Now, that's not to say that it's really hard to talk about opportunity when there's so much, one unknown, but obviously at the human level, there's a lot of people who are struggling and badly impacted by everything that's going on. But for procurement as a profession, there's certainly never been a time that what we can do has been more in need by the organizations that we work with. That doesn't mean that we're not going to be as impacted as any other department. And there's probably going to be this call to do a lot more with less, just as any other department's going to be faced with. But really, that with that opportunity does come the risk that if, we've fought for years. We've talked at Art of Procurement, we've helped clients think about how can we expand the value proposition of procurement? How can we really look at value beyond savings? That savings is just part of a balanced scorecard. And that's sometimes a struggle. It takes a long time to change the hearts and the minds, the perceptions of what procurement is, to be more than just, hey, we'll bring procurement to beat our suppliers up when we need some quick cash or some quick savings. Now we have this platform and there's a strong desire and need for expense management. If we go in and we do our old tricks, and we just focus purely on that and we focus on that in the short term, I totally agree that really once the business cycles change, it's like, let's put procurement back in the box again because we don't need them. Because, it kind of, we've got to be thinking about how do we make the savings stick? How are we responsible? How do we make them sustainable? As opposed to just going and saying, okay, how can we get the quickest, beat up the suppliers, let's do some negotiation, let's do some sourcing events, all the stuff that we're known for, because that's just going to really concrete people's perception of what we are.
Yeah, and I think changing, a lot of the ways that savings come obviously is changing suppliers and finding lower cost sources of supply. But then you've got all manner of risks that come from new providers, and you've potentially just trashed a relationship. And I remember reading an article. It was a procurement leaders article. It was a few years back, but it was actually attributed to the CPO at Ford at the time, and you started life at Ford. And it was every piece of innovation that we have in our car comes from the suppliers. And it was like, whoa, okay, that was just a really one of those statements you kind of read and you go, oh, of course it does.
Yeah, I mean, when you're developing a new vehicle, for example, I mean, engineers will have the ideas, but I don't think it's too out of line to say that they don't necessarily know how to commercialize those ideas. And that's what the supply base are able to do, and what procurement can do working with supply base. They take this design, this drawing, this new product, whatever it may be, and actually bring it to life. Working obviously with those engineers, but it's often it's a capability that an organization typically doesn't have themselves. So, obviously not losing sight of innovation and all the ways that we can help our organization. What you say about relationships is so important. We think about this hamster wheel that procurement's brought in when we're struggling, when the company needs quick cash, quick savings. So we come in and we upset a lot of people, but we deliver on huge savings goals. And then business conditions change, and so the business wants something else, and we wonder, why are we not going along for the ride? And so we then, ultimately what happens is all those folks who have created difficult relationships and trust issues, both with stakeholders and suppliers, get let go. A new team comes in and they come in with a mandate of, we're going to improve relationships with our suppliers. It's going to be about collaboration. It's going to be about value beyond savings and innovation, supplier-enabled innovation. So you deliberately leave money on the table, and then there's a burning platform to save money. And so then folks come in and just take it all away. You get into that cycle, it's very, very difficult to get out of it. And I think that's something we just have to keep at the front of our mind as we are obviously pursuing expense reduction, expense management strategies right now.
And I saw that actually on your recent podcast series and the articles that you wrote and the worksheets that you put out, and we'll put links to those things, by the way, in this session as well. And you specifically referenced the hamster wheel, and I thought that I'm glad that you brought that up again, because I did look at it and go, yep, that sounds very familiar, very familiar. So that's a nice way to think about, especially when we've thought about supply relationships. I listened to a webinar from Ardent Partners last week, I think it was. And it was on virtualcporising.com is the link. Again, all links and stuff that we've talked about, we're going to make sure that are in the you call it show notes. It'll be some way that however we put this out, there'll be some format of being able to put links in. And there were two statistics that I thought really, really jumped out at me at this webinar. And I'm pretty sure this webinar is you can download and look at it again.
Like register to go and view it again.
Yeah, there will be. So the two bits that jumped out are only 34% of businesses have an active supply risk program, and supply risk has been a big blind spot, and only 21% of procurement teams, which means that 79% of teams don't have a comprehensive supply risk program targeting strategic suppliers. Those suppliers that's going to deliver the innovation. We don't have visibility, and only 9% of the teams were focused on improving that. And personally, I look at that and go, that's not only is it a blind spot in understanding our suppliers, and the one bit I would possibly change in just saying strategic suppliers is strategic supply chain, because I think this lack of visibility from tier 1 to tier 2 is something that has been caught out. And there was a session from Ian Bremner on the Ariba Live stuff that came out in March, where he talked about that. He talked about global supply chains and the amount of stuff that was single sourced with no kind of backup. So that kind of supply risk program really jumped out at me. And
there was something that I was going to bring up as well is, I think it's important when we think about risk. There's two actual things. One is when we talk about risk doesn't necessarily mean physical supply chains. Doesn't just mean products and services. A lot of times when I'm talking to procurement pros in some of the training that we do around risk, there's this kind of mindset that, well, I buy services, so this doesn't apply to me. it's a lot more nuanced for sure, because it's not kind of, you can't say, well, it's going to get shipped from point A to point B, and this is the raw materials that's going to go in. But you can think about, what are the elements that are needed for that provider to be able to provide that service to you? Can the employees get to work? Is there an office that's open? Things like that. So don't just think, oh, I buy services, risk doesn't apply to me. And the other thing, which maybe steps back a little bit, we're talking about how to, now that we're in the middle of a risk event, you don't necessarily want to say, hey, I told you so. If only you'd have done what I'd asked you all this time ago. But I talked to a chief risk officer on the pod actually a couple of years ago. And one of the things that she was saying is that, the best time to get buy-in for the next risk event is when you're in the middle of one. And so, don't be shy about talking about ways that things could have been different, or taking lessons learned. Make sure that you really build lessons learned into your disaster recovery activities and initiatives, because that's going to be the point where the pain is the highest, where there is going to be a desire that things are going to be different. I wonder this time around, it's so deep, it impacts us in so many different ways. We're all forming new habits that perhaps this time it's not going to be forgotten, and risk is going to be at the top of the agenda. But we can't assume that it's going to be the case when things get back to whatever normal is.
Another webinar that I listened to a couple of days ago with Barrow and Simply, they were the two people who did it. And I know Harry, and so I'll shout out to Harry Banger for that. And Harry's one of the people that I'm hoping can also come and co-host at some point as well, because he's got a really interesting point of view. But one of the things that they turned around and did say on sort of their last bit was a resilient supply chain has to, when you start thinking about your single sourcing suppliers, when you're looking at the backup suppliers, avoid them being in the same location for your, speaks directly to your point. There's lots of other good things about risk on that podcast as well.
I saw it firsthand in, and this is why I say risk isn't just physical product, it's also services. So back in the outsourcing world, I saw it with call centers. So there was a category strategy that was developed. Fortunately, it was one that I inherited rather than one that I put into place, where, the team had done the right things, because they'd looked and said, I think we're too reliant on a single service provider, because we have tens of thousands of people who are doing, on the phones or helping us in mortgage underwriting, or you name it, but we basically had very small number of suppliers. And so how do we mitigate risk? Well, we're going to go and make sure we have multiple different suppliers, so that if one fails, the whole system doesn't break down. What they did was they did that, but they placed all the call centers in Manila, in the Philippines. And so you have a typhoon in Manila. It's something that's a pretty high probability event. It happens all the time. The entire city shuts down. The risk is that people can't get into the office. They can't get to work. It doesn't matter if you got 10 suppliers. If they're all in the same place and the city is out of order for a week, you get a really tough time bringing things back online. And I'm seeing that, across the board about, in fact, just before we got on the call, I saw something that was released today, I think by, maybe by JP Morgan, basically a survey of CFOs right now and what their focuses are. Basically number one is cash, number two is reducing expenses, number three is supply chain resiliency. And then you get, down to, I think number four was internal teams. So the expense management and risk is top of the shop, right now for everybody. And so, and we're obviously well placed to be able to manage that, to help organizations manage that. So, one thing I'd say is let's be proactive. Instead of waiting to be asked, how we're going to protect the organization against certain things happening, now is a time for us to be proactive, to show that we've been thinking about this all along.
Absolutely.
We actually have the answer. We actually have some of the answers.
And there's a lot of stuff out there that I think can help. You've published the expense management reduction toolkit and articles. Plus, obviously, there's the risk management stuff that you've talked about in your podcasts. There's the 5-part series that PASA did as well in terms of conducting risk assessments. A lot of this starts, and the Barrow webinar that I talked about. was three quick actions, but they all are reliant on data and visibility, and getting visibility into your suppliers and getting visibility into your supply chains. But I think we've talked about supply risk, which is, it's more important now from a 2020 to 2019 perspective, from on procurement agenda. And to your point, I think rather than waiting for people to say, hey, what are we doing about risk? We could actually turn around and go, this is what we want to do. There might be an investment either in people or technology of some description. But if there is, then there's a clear ROI and payback on it right now.
Yeah, I think right now the quickest you can show a payback of anything, then you've obviously got a bit better case for a better chance of making that business case. I'd also say that you can do 80% of the work by asking some pretty basic questions. Especially when it comes to what risks should we focus on. Some of the things we talked about before around is it a material, product, or service to what we buy? What does the supply market look like? What's the switching costs look like? They're not necessarily difficult questions that you probably have the answers to. You don't even need to ask a stakeholder to pretty quickly whittle it down to say, okay, I may have a universe of 10,000 suppliers. We only need to be focused on these categories, and in these categories, there's 100. That's my starting point. Then you can start to do things like looking at supply chain mapping, doing FMEAs to look for your failure points, things like that. But again, doesn't need to be huge, big assessments. But what you try to do is you try to go again from that 10,000 down to the 50 or the 20 that I really have to care about right now, today, to protect the business. So a lot of this can seem really overwhelming, when you talk about it. So I guess that's a point I wanted to make, is it doesn't have to be overwhelming. You're not necessarily looking to get it 100% right, because right now we're all trying to do things as quickly as we can. Don't be overwhelmed.
So Phil, what's on your agenda for the next sort of 6-9 months?
Yeah, so we're obviously helping organizations find their way through everything that they're being faced with right now, all the kind of new challenges that have come up from a procurement perspective in the expense management space and the risk mitigation management space. But we're also working on launching a product called Art Procurement, or AOP Mastermind, which is really bringing together procurement excellence forums, learning workshops. We have an executive mastermind program, a number of different elements for different organizations, different levels within the organization, to really help teams elevate the impact. Ultimately, a lot of things you might get from in-person training, in-person events that you can't get these days because everything's virtual. So we're just pulling together that product and launching it in a week or two. Here we are at the beginning of May. So that's going to be a primary focus for us over the Northern Hemisphere summer that we're coming into. So really excited to get that out.
So Phil, thank you very much for spending the time with us today. Very much appreciate it. Look forward to doing this again at some point in the future if you're happy to do that. Stay safe, stay well. Yeah,
honored to be invited. Thank you very much, and like I said, good luck with the rest of the series. And I'm happy to come back and join you whenever and if ever you want. So thank you.
Awesome.